There are 11 people alive on this platform because of decisions I made. There are 4 people dead because of decisions I made. I want to be precise about that arithmetic before anything else because the way you frame a number determines what you're allowed to feel about it, and I've spent enough of my life inside financial models to know that the frame is never neutral. 11 alive, 4 dead. I made both sets of decisions. The comfort I'm denied by that accounting is deliberate. It's the only honest thing I have left. My name is Garrett Voss. I am 51 years old. Before the outbreak, I ran a quantitative trading desk for a mid-sized hedge fund in Houston, Texas. I built algorithmic systems that identified market inefficiencies and exploited them at speeds measured in microseconds. I was not the person who understood the companies whose stocks we traded. I was the person who understood the patterns those stocks made, the signatures of behavior that repeated across markets and across time, the deep regularities underneath the apparent chaos. I was very good at it. In 2021, I used 14 years of being very good at it to purchase a decommissioned offshore oil production platform located in the Gulf of Mexico, approximately 62 miles south-southwest of Port Fortune, Louisiana. The platform, designated MA7 in its operational life, had been taken out of service by its previous owner following the collapse of a marginal well that had never produced at projected yield. It sat on its 4 legs in 90 feet of water and rusted gently in the Gulf air. I paid $890,000 for it. The remaining $5.31 million went into what I described to the marine engineering firm I hired as a long-term habitation conversion. What it actually was, and I understood this clearly even then, even before any of the models I'd built suggested the specific shape the future would take, was a fortress. A fortress built on water. I should explain the models. Not to justify myself. The models didn't require justification then and don't require it now. They were correct in their outputs even when their assumptions were wrong, which is the particular danger of quantitative systems. They can be precisely right about the wrong thing. Beginning in 2018, I had been running a suite of models I'd built in the margins of my professional work, during evenings and weekends, using publicly available data on epidemiological spread rates, supply chain fragility, social trust collapse, and infrastructure interdependence. The models were not predicting a zombie outbreak specifically. The models were predicting the conditions under which any sufficiently severe disruption to the biological safety assumptions underlying modern civilization would produce a cascading failure of the systems that kept large numbers of human beings alive. The models were predicting, in other words, the shape of what was coming without knowing its specific content. They gave me approximately 4 to 7 years. The mid-range estimate was 2024. The outbreak started in 2024. I tell you this not because I want credit for the prediction, but because the prediction is the context for every decision that followed. When the outbreak began, I had been preparing for it for 3 years. My platform was converted. My supplies were staged. My personnel were selected. My plans were documented. I was, by any reasonable measure, ready. What I was not ready for was the specific nature of readiness that actually mattered. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The conversion took 22 months and involved a marine engineering firm in Galveston, a structural specialist from Aberdeen, Scotland, a systems integrator who'd worked on Antarctic research stations, and a rotating crew of 37 workers whose NDAs I had reviewed by 3 separate attorneys. The platform's production deck was stripped entirely, the derrick removed, the crane structures repurposed as structural supports for a new upper level I built above the existing main deck, connected by an enclosed stairwell I'd had fabricated from marine-grade steel. Below the main deck in the platform substructure, The former equipment spaces were converted into what the engineering documents called habitation modules. What they were was living quarters, 12 cabins, each one roughly the dimensions of a ship's stateroom, with a berth, storage, a small porthole cut into the hull and fitted with impact-resistant polycarbonate. Below the habitation deck, the former pontoon structure, the large horizontal buoyancy members that connected the platform's legs, had been converted into storage, sealed, pressurized, accessible via watertight hatches. I had stockpiled inside them the following: enough freeze-dried and canned food to sustain 20 people for 36 months, calculated at 2,200 calories per person per day. Water filtration and reverse osmosis equipment capable of producing 800 gallons of potable water daily from the surrounding Gulf, supplemented by a 16,000-gallon freshwater reserve. A medical bay with equipment and pharmaceutical stores sufficient for most trauma and illness scenarios short of major surgery, and a manual annotated, cross-referenced, written for an intelligent non-physician, explaining the procedures involved. A communications suite with satellite uplink, VHF, HF radio, and a dedicated frequency for what I privately designated as the recovery phase. 3 diesel generators, each capable of running the platform independently, backed by a solar array I'd had installed on the upper deck, and a battery bank that could sustain minimum operations for 72 hours without generation. A workshop, a gym, a greenhouse module, 12 feet by 30, built into the upper deck behind windbreak panels, with grow lights and a hydroponic system capable of producing supplemental fresh vegetables in perpetuity, given maintenance and seed stock. I had planned for everything. I had planned specifically for everything I could measure. My selection process for personnel was methodical. I identified 11 people over 18 months, not friends, not family, people I'd mapped against a skill matrix I'd built based on my model's projections about what competencies would be most valuable in an extended offshore habitation scenario. Medical, Dr. Inez Carvalho, 44, emergency physician at Houston Methodist. I'd been introduced to her at a charity function, noted her competence in conversation, and spent 4 months finding a pretext to discuss survivalism before finally presenting the platform proposal directly. She had said yes in under 30 seconds. I have thought about that often since. Engineering. Marcus Tran, 39. Marine systems engineer with 17 years experience on offshore rigs, including 7 years on the specific class of structure I'd purchased. He knew my platform's type better than the marine engineering firm I'd hired to convert it. I found him through a professional network and paid him a consulting fee for 2 years before the outbreak to maintain the conversion systems on periodic visits. Security. Lieutenant Commander Diane Acaffer, Ret. 46. 12 years with the U.S. Navy, specializing in small vessel operations and force protection. I'd located her through a veterans placement firm and hired her as a security consultant for the platform. She understood what the platform was for and asked no questions that suggested she disagreed with the premise. The remaining 8 were adjacent. Inez had a husband, Tamaz, 61, a former architect who brought no critical skill but whose absence would have cost me Inez. Marcus had a daughter, Riley, 17, a mechanical aptitude that I noted but didn't weight heavily because she was 17. Diane had a partner, Quame, 53, a high school chemistry teacher whose inclusion was relational before it became useful. The others I will name because they deserve to be named rather than categorized. Priya Nair, 31, biochemist, selected for skill. Leon Hartley, 44. Commercial fisherman from Grand Isle, Louisiana, selected for skill and for his specific knowledge of Gulf navigation and weather pattern. Cora Finch, 58, retired electrical engineer, selected for skill. and 3 others attached to those 3 by relationships I'd accommodated as relational costs. 14 people in total, including me. That was the plan. The plan did not include what happened on the drive to Port Fortune. The outbreak reached Houston on what I was later told was day 4 of the recognized national emergency, though the actual day 1 was a matter of significant subsequent debate that I am not qualified to resolve. I activated the platform plan on day 6. By that point, the models I'd been running in real time since the outbreak's earliest reports were converging on a single output. The window for orderly relocation to the platform was closing faster than the pessimistic scenario had projected. The infrastructure supporting maritime access, the fuel supply chains, the port operations, the navigation systems, was degrading at a rate that would make the 62-mile open-water transit progressively more dangerous and ultimately impossible within what I estimated was 10 to 14 days. I called every person on my list. 11 of the 14 answered. The 3 who didn't, Priya Nair, her partner whose name I am not going to include here for reasons that will become apparent, and one of the relational adjacents. I attempted to reach for 4 hours before the models told me that 4 hours was the threshold beyond which waiting became its own cause of failure. I activated without them. The transit vessel I'd pre-staged at Port Fortune was a 60-foot crew boat I'd purchased and had maintained under a leasing arrangement that kept it crewed and operational without requiring me to explain its purpose to anyone. The captain, a man named Dwayne Arsenault, 57, had worked Gulf supply vessels for 30 years. He had been on my list since 2022. He was standing on the dock when we arrived. We were 11 people, my 10 plus Dwayne, loading a crew boat at a fuel dock in Port Fortune, Louisiana, on day 6 of a national emergency, while the town behind us was beginning to understand what a national emergency actually meant at the individual human scale. That understanding made sound. I will not describe the sound specifically. I will say that Dwayne cast off the dock lines without being asked, and that we were 100 yards offshore before anyone spoke. The platform, when we arrived at dusk on day 6, was the most reassuring thing I had ever seen. Standing on 4 steel legs in flat Gulf water, lit by the solar-charged LED arrays I'd had installed on the perimeter, visible for miles in every direction, surrounded by water that nothing could cross without being seen. It was exactly what I'd designed it to be. It was also, as I would spend the next several months learning, exactly what I hadn't designed it to be. The first problem was Dwayne. Dwayne Arsenault had been on my list as a transit asset. I needed someone who could operate the crew boat. Dwayne could operate the crew boat. The plan designated him as the platform's primary vessel operator, responsible for maintenance of the crew boat, occasional short-range transit if required, and general marine operations support. What I had not modeled was Dwayne as a person. Dwayne was, I discovered in the first 72 hours of shared habitation, the kind of man who talks. Not excessively, not thoughtlessly, but continuously in the way that certain people process the world, by narrating it to others, by turning experience into story in real time. He had spent 30 years on Gulf crew boats and had developed the particular communicative density of someone whose professional life is spent in small groups of people in confined spaces. He talked to everyone, about the Gulf, about the platform systems which he assessed with a professional eye and described with the specificity of a craftsman, about his 23 years of marriage to a woman named Cecile, who was in Baton Rouge with their daughter, and who he had not been able to reach before we departed, and who he spoke about with a calm that I eventually understood was not equanimity, but its opposite, the enforced stillness of someone sitting on a grief too large to let out in a metal room 62 miles from shore. Dwayne talked, and people listened, and the listening changed things. The first week on the platform, my group was still my group. 11 people organized around a set of systems and protocols I'd built, operating within a structure I'd designed. The skill matrix functioned. Inez managed the medical bay. Marcus managed the engineering systems. Diane managed security protocol, which in practice meant the schedule of watches she and I had designed for monitoring the surrounding water approaches. But Dwayne talked. And around his talking, something organized that I hadn't planned for. Community. Not the functional kind I'd planned for functional. The other kind. The kind that forms when people sit together after dinner and someone tells a story and someone else tells a story in response, and the stories become a texture that connects people in ways that skill matrices don't account for. I didn't know how to do that. I could run the meeting. I could present the data. I could manage the systems. I could tell 11 people what the models said and what the plan required and what each person's designated role was within that plan. I could not sit in the common area after dinner and tell Quaim, the chemistry teacher, a story that made him feel less alone in the specific way that Dwayne could. I noticed this deficit the way I noticed market inefficiencies, as a pattern in the data that I didn't immediately have a model for. Dr. Inez Carvalho confronted me on day 19. She came to the communications room, where I maintained the platform's monitoring station, at 2200 hours, when I was running the nightly review of the satellite feeds and the fuel consumption logs. She sat down across from me without asking, which she had never done before, and said, "Riley is struggling." Riley was Marcus's daughter, 17. She had been on the platform for 19 days and had spent most of those days in the workshop, assisting Marcus with maintenance tasks and the rest of them in her cabin. She had contributed meaningfully to every practical task she'd been assigned. She had eaten her full caloric allocation. She had attended every group briefing. She had also, Inez told me, been crying every night for 19 days in a manner that was audible through the walls of her cabin to anyone in the adjacent spaces. "She's grieving," Inez said. "Her mother is onshore. She doesn't know whether her mother is alive. She's 17 and she doesn't know whether her mother is alive, and she's been on a metal platform in the middle of the ocean for 19 days, and you have not once asked her how she is." I had not. The models didn't require me to ask Riley how she was. The models required me to ensure the platform systems were operational, and the supply consumption was within parameters, and the watch rotation was maintained, and the perimeter was monitored. "She needs someone to talk to," Inez said. "She has her father. Her father is also grieving his wife's uncertainty, and is working 14-hour days maintaining your platform systems, because working is how he's coping, and that's fine for him, and it leaves Riley alone." I did not have a protocol for this. I said, "What do you want me to do?" And Inez said, "Talk to her, not about the platform, not about the plan, about her." I went to Riley's cabin the next morning. I knocked. She opened the door. She was 17 and she'd been crying, and she looked at me with the wary, exhausted expression of someone who has been told to be grateful and is running low on the resource required for gratitude. I said, "Can I come in?" She stepped back and I sat on the small chair beside her bunk, and I looked at the porthole and the flat gray gulf beyond it, and I said, honestly, because I had no other register available, "I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to talk to people about things that don't have solutions, but I was told you needed someone to talk to, and I'm available, so I'm here." She looked at me for a long time. Then she said, "Do you think my mom is alive?" I had run the models on Houston. I knew what they said about the infection rate curves and the population density and the timeline of infrastructure collapse. I knew the numbers. I said, "I don't know. I don't have the data to say yes, and I'm not willing to lie to you to make you feel better." She said, "Okay." Then she said, My mom's name is Sandra. She's 53. She taught herself Spanish from CDs in the car when she was driving my brother and me to swim practice for 6 years. She makes tamales from scratch at Christmas, and they're better than any restaurants because she uses her own chili paste that she makes in August and freezes in portions. I said nothing. She said, I want someone to know that, in case. I said, I know it now. That was not in the models. Neither was the fact that I went back to Riley's cabin every evening for the next 3 weeks and listened to more things about Sandra, and that those 3 weeks changed my understanding of what the platform was for in a way that 22 months of engineering and $6.2 million had not. The first death happened on day 31. His name was Tomás Inez's husband, 61, the former architect. He had been on the platform because his absence would have cost me Inez. That was the calculation. He contributed no critical skill. He was adjacent. He was also, as I learned only after the fact, in the late stages of a cardiac condition that he had not disclosed to me, to Inez, or to anyone else, because the disclosure would have excluded him from the platform, and the platform was where Inez was. And Tomás had spent 34 years making decisions based on the principle that being where Inez was constituted a sufficient reason for most things. Inez found him in the morning in their cabin. She had the composure of an emergency physician for approximately 4 minutes. Then she did not. What followed the next 24 hours is not something I will reconstruct fully. I will say that it reorganized the platform's population in a way that no engineering decision had. When someone dies in a confined space, when the body is present and the people who loved that person are present, and there is nowhere to go and nothing to do except be in the same room with it, the particular kind of community that Dwayne had been building with his talking and his stories becomes the only thing that functions. I did not know what to do. Dwayne did. He sat with Inez. He didn't talk. Dwayne, who talked about everything, sat with Inez in her cabin with Tomás's body and was simply present with her in a way that required nothing of her except the willingness to be in the same room as another person's witness. I stood in the corridor outside and understood, clearly and too late, that what I had built for the end of the world was a very expensive collection of systems and a very thin collection of people, and that the systems were performing exactly as designed, and that this was insufficient, and that the insufficiency was mine. We committed Tomás's body to the Gulf on day 32. Marcus fabricated a weighted shroud from platform materials. Dwayne ran the crew boat out half a mile to deeper water. 11 people stood on the aft deck in Gulf wind that smelled of salt and distance, and Inez said something in Portuguese that she did not translate, and Tomás went into the water. Then we came back to the platform, and we went back to work. That is what survival requires. The continuity of function in the presence of irreplaceable loss. I understood it abstractly before day 32. After day 32, I understood it in the register where understanding becomes a different kind of thing. The communication situation changed on day 44. Cora Finch, the retired electrical engineer, had been working on the communications suite since day 8, attempting to extend its range and sensitivity beyond the manufacturer's specifications using materials from the platform's workshop, and what I can only describe as the specific creative destructiveness of someone who spent 40 years engineering systems and spent retirement missing it. On day 44, she achieved a stable connection on a frequency she identified from pre-outbreak emergency preparedness documentation as a FEMA auxiliary coordination band. What came through was not FEMA. It was a woman's voice, clear and close, transmitting from what the signal strength suggested was within 100 miles. She was identifying herself as the communications officer for something she called the Coastal Coordination Network, based out of an operational facility in the Atchafalaya Basin, and she was repeating a message. Any offshore installation, any vessel, any fixed structure. We are operational. We are receiving. We have medical, we have food, we have fuel. We are building something. If you are out there, you do not have to be alone. Cora looked at me. I looked at the frequency dial. The platform was 62 miles offshore. We were sealed, supplied, monitored, and entirely self-sufficient. The models gave us 34 months at current consumption rates. The Atchafalaya Basin, swampland, partially accessible by water, was an unknown variable. The Coastal Coordination Network was an unknown variable. The woman's voice was an unknown variable. My entire framework for making decisions was built on the elimination of unknown variables. Cora said, "We're answering that." Not asking. "We're answering that," she said, and her hand was on the transmit button. "I want to tell you exactly what happened in the next 60 seconds. Cora's hand was on the transmit button. I thought about the models. Then I thought about Tomas in the weighted shroud. I thought about Riley in the cabin, telling me about her mother and the tamales. I thought about Dwayne sitting with Anise in the room where her husband's body was, saying nothing, being present. I thought about the $6.2 million I had spent making it possible to survive in isolation at the center of the Gulf of Mexico. And I thought about the 11 people who were surviving in it. And I thought about the word surviving and what it actually meant as opposed to what I had always used it to mean. I said, "Go ahead." Cora transmitted. The woman's name was Dr. Simone Ademi. She was 48 years old. Before the outbreak, she had run the epidemiology program at LSU and had spent 23 years studying the specific dynamics of disease transmission in coastal and wetland environments. She was, in ways I couldn't have predicted, exactly the person the outbreak needed in exactly the geographic position where she could do the most good. She had established the Coastal Coordination Network out of a research station in the Atchafalaya Basin, using prepositioned emergency resources and an organizational competence that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with the specific knowledge of how communities work in water environments, knowledge she'd accumulated by studying the fishing communities of coastal Louisiana for 2 decades. She had, by day 44, connected 14 separate groups of survivors, fishing camps, oil industry vessels, elevated structures, into a network that shared information, resources, and medical capability across a stretch of Gulf Coast that would otherwise have been a collection of isolated pockets of people trying to be their own solutions. She needed 3 things from us: a high-quality communications relay point, which the platform, at 62 miles offshore and elevated 40 feet above sea level, could provide better than anything else in the network. Medical capability, specifically Anise and the platform's pharmaceutical stores. And Quame, the chemistry teacher. She needed Quame because she had identified a need to produce disinfectants, water treatment compounds, and basic pharmaceutical precursors from available coastal materials. And she needed someone who understood chemistry well enough to do it safely and to teach others. I had brought Quame as a relational adjacent. He was there because Diane was there. He was what the network needed most. I want to pause here and explain something about the models. The models were correct. They predicted the collapse of the systems I'd modeled, the supply chains, the infrastructure, the social trust mechanisms. They predicted the timeline within their era ranges. They told me to prepare, and I prepared, and the preparation kept 11 people alive through the first 44 days of the worst event in living memory. The models were also wrong. They were wrong about what surviving was for. I had built the models to optimize for individual group survival. The metric was, keep the people I'd selected alive for as long as possible within a controlled environment. The platform was the controlled environment. The selected people were the 11-eyed assembled. The models had no term for the Coastal Coordination Network. The models had no term for Simone Adami. The models had no term for Quame's chemistry knowledge, serving 14 survivor groups across 100 miles of Gulf Coast. The models had no term for the relay signal that the platform started broadcasting on day 45, that extended the network's communications range by 60 miles in every offshore direction, and connected 3 additional survivor groups who had been invisible to the network because they were too far from shore. The models had no term for any of this because the models were built around the assumption that survival was individual. Survival is not individual. I know this now. I knew it abstractly before the outbreak, the way you know things that your framework doesn't have room for. I know it now in the register where knowledge costs something. The second and third deaths happened on day 67. I will tell you what happened plainly. Leon Hartley, the commercial fisherman from Grand Isle, had been making shore-trained transit runs in the crew boat to coordinate physical supply transfers with network vessels that couldn't reach the platform directly. This was his function, and he was exceptional at it. He understood Gulf water, weather, and small vessel behavior with the accumulated knowledge of a man who'd spent his life on it. On day 67, he took the crew boat out to meet a supply transfer from a network vessel 30 miles northeast. He did not return. The network vessel arrived at the platform 2 hours later. Their captain told us Leon had transferred the supplies and departed on a return bearing. The weather had been clear. The sea state was manageable. There was no debris, no signal. Leon Hartley was lost at sea on day 67 of the outbreak, and I have no more information than that. His wife, who he had not been able to contact since day 6, was later located at the Baton Rouge survivor settlement and was told what I've just told you. I know because Simone Adami told me 6 months later that she had made the contact personally and had sat with Leon's wife for 3 hours, and that Leon's wife had said, "Tell me something he did, something specific." After Simone told her about the supply runs, the way Leon read the water, the way he narrated the Gulf to people who didn't know it, the same way Dwayne narrated everything, not to fill silence, but to give people a frame for something larger than themselves. The 4th death was Cora Finch. Day 71, pneumonia. Inez treated her for 5 days with the platform's pharmaceutical stores. On the 6th day, Cora's lungs filled with something the antibiotics couldn't address, and she died in the medical bay with Inez beside her and the entire platform population in the corridor outside, because there wasn't room for all of us inside. Cora was 58 years old, and she had built the communications link that connected us to the network, and by extension to every survivor group the network served. The relay equipment she had modified was still running when she died. It is still running. I want to say that clearly. It is still running. I told you at the beginning that 11 people are alive because of decisions I made. I should be more precise. 11 people arrived on the platform because of decisions I made. Several of those 11 people are alive today because of decisions other people made, Inez's medical decisions, Dwayne's social decisions, Marcus's engineering decisions, Riley's decision to tell me about Sandra and the tamales, which I include because it changed my understanding in a way that subsequently changed my decisions in ways I can't fully trace but believe were consequential. The 4 who died, Tamaz, who I brought as a relational cost and who turned out to be a person rather than a cost, Cora, who I brought for her skills and who exceeded them, Leon, who I brought for his skills and who exceeded them, and one of the 3 I couldn't reach on day 6, whose outcome I learned later and will not describe here except to say that the model's outputs for Houston at day 6 were accurate, and that accuracy is not the same as comfort, and that I carry both without being able to reconcile them. I run logistics for the Coastal Coordination Network now. Not algorithms, not models. Logistics in the physical sense, what goes where and how, the routing of resources through a network that now connects 47 survivor communities across 300 miles of Gulf Coast and the interior waterways of coastal Louisiana. I use spreadsheets. I count things. I track consumption and production and transit times and network capacity. The skills didn't change. What they are in service of changed. The platform is still operational. Marcus and Dwayne maintain it. Riley, who is now 18, has taken over Cora's communications role with a thoroughness that would have surprised me if I had learned anything slower. We are no longer alone on it. The platform hosts a rotating crew of 8 to 12 people from the network, technicians, communications operators, medical personnel rotating through from Simone's facility. It is a waypoint and a relay and a medical staging point, and on clear nights, when the Gulf is flat and the sky is enormous, and the lights of the other network vessels are visible on the water in every direction, it is something I don't have a technical term for. Something I'd need Dwayne to describe. Something I would have called, before all of this, an inefficiency. Before all of this, I would have seen a group of people on a steel platform in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico, using resources suboptimally, maintaining relationships that cost time and calories, talking when they should have been sleeping, sitting with each other in rooms where nothing productive was occurring. I would have seen waste. I see it now for what it is. I see it now as the only thing that worked. Simone Ademi asked me once, maybe 4 months in, on a satellite call when the network had just made contact with a survivor group in the Yucatan, the first international connection. She asked me what I would have done differently. I said less. She waited. I said I would have spent less. I would have built less. I would have selected less carefully and planned less precisely and optimized less ruthlessly. And I would have called the 11 people on my list on day 1 instead of day 6, and I would have told them the truth about what I'd built and why, and I would have asked them to bring whoever they needed to bring. Why didn't you? I thought about this for a long time. Because the model didn't have room for whoever they needed to bring, and I trusted the model more than I trusted the people. Do you still? The relay equipment Cora built was humming in the communications room. The Gulf was dark outside the porthole. 47 communities were connected to each other through a network that ran, in part, through a decommissioned oil platform I'd bought for $890,000 and converted for $5.31 million, and which was currently serving a function that bore no relationship to any purpose I'd imagined for it. No, I said, I trust the people now. Good, Simone said, because I need you to come to the basin next week. We have a problem I need your mind on, and bring Quame. His batch yields are still inconsistent, and I think it's a temperature variable in the condensation phase. I wrote it down. I still count things. The column that matters is the one Simone runs. The number in it goes up.